And there are
Thank you, Sharon.
sweet treats out by the coffee.
We do, thank you. Coffee, and so anytime you need to get up and use the restroom, please go ahead and do that. We will take some breaks, but we're going to hit it a little harder in the morning because after lunch it's a little, so we're going to hit a little harder in the morning. So we're going to start by just talking about this timeline that you see in front of you. So if you want to stretch yours out, I'll tell you the meaning of this a little bit. It looks confusing, and there is a lot on there, and that's true, there is. So 25 years ago, I went to a week-long seminar in the Twin Cities to learn how to teach a Bible study process called Crossways. An Australian Lutheran pastor, probably in the late 60s, began to go into congregations and realized that he really found that his congregation and people of the Lutheran Church in general were really biblically illiterate. And so he began to try to wonder, how can I teach this? Rather than just teach themes from the catechism, which he does, and we always will do, he said people got to know the biblical story from beginning to end in order for Jesus really to make sense. And so he went about this process to begin to teach the Bible as a big, long process. But then he also said people learn not just audibly, but we also are visual people. And you'll learn more when you attach a visual to something that you're learning. And then he says you learn even more when you actually attach doing the work, listening to it, and seeing it. So that's kind of the design around this teaching process. So there is a way of looking through the Bible that I've done before called Crossways. It's 60 units. And when I've done it in the past, I've done it over 2 years because you commit to meeting 30 times. There goes my slide right down. You commit to meeting 30 times a year at a 2-hour-a-night process. So it's a big commitment, and not everybody can make that big, long commitment. So he did devise ways to do this in shorter patterns called the divine drama, and then see through the scriptures. And then finally, he came up with this model as well called the Bible for Busy People, which a lot of us are, where in a workshop we can kind of walk through this biblical story. So this timeline has 24 frames on it. That's the main part. These pictures, 22 of them are, 22 frames. We're going to walk through each of those frames, okay? They take us from Genesis to Jesus and the second coming. And we're going to walk through each of those frames. Now, underneath it are those little pictures, right? I mean, little words. I got to get my cheaters. I realize I don't have them because I cannot read them without my cheaters. They're back in my office. So we're going to walk through that, and we're not going to really read that. But I got to tell you, after I did this seminar 25 years ago, once or twice a year, I would walk through this just for my own sake, reading the Bible passages underneath each of the frames with the text, just to let it ingrain in my mind. And that's from a guy, obviously, who's done a lot of studying of the scriptures. So I'm not going to expect that you're going to walk away knowing exactly what everything is about the Bible, but we're going to give you a big picture of it and help you to hear the story. When we're in worship, you're going to kind of like, oh yeah, that maybe makes more sense now. Okay? So we're going to focus on these 22 frames. Now, if you look at the timeline, he's got the first frame, question mark, and a clock. We really don't know exactly how long the first 11 chapters of Genesis took. There's really no way to historically measure that. But at about 2000 BC is when we get introduced to the first biblical characters that we're going to focus in on, called Abraham and Sarah. So about 1900 BC to 200 BC, and then just 100-year increments all the way till we get to the birth of Jesus, and then the first 100 years of the early church. Okay? So most of these slides are Old Testament driven. Not till we get to frame 19 and 20 do we get to the New Testament. All right? And so we're going to focus a lot on the Old Testament today. And all these little numbers up here at the top, the first group are called Judges. They're going to happen around this 1200 to or 1700 to 1600 BC time frame. And then we got kings that are listed. So all the kings that are listed in the Bible, in the book of Samuel and Kings, they're there, they're numbered, and you're going to find their corresponding numbers in this part of the timeline up here. Okay? Don't worry about that right now. We're not going to deal with that. I'm just kind of giving you the framework of it. Okay? And then they've got all the numbers with these prophets as well. If you look at that where it says prophets, and they've got the little circles, their numbers are historically placed up in this time frame as well. Again, not a major thing, just pointing out some of the details to it. Our focus today, we're going to mainly be on these frames, okay? But I just want you to see the time frame of it. So here's the 4 sections in it. So the first 6 frames, 1 through 6, deal with creation to the story of the Exodus. Okay? Then we've got frames number 5 through 10. That deals, or from 6, from the Exodus to the time of the kings and the division of the kings with Solomon. And then what happened after Solomon. Okay, so roughly 1400 BC to around 900 BC. Then the next set of frames deal with the prophets, 11 through 15. These are the time of the prophets. One of the hugest parts of the Bible are the prophets. Okay, and they're historically set in this time frame from about 900 BC to 600 BC. And then we've got the story of the exile, what happened in the exile, after the exile, and then finally we get these last set of frames from 15 to 22. And these first couple frames, 15, 16, 17, 18, they deal with what's happening in those couple hundred years before Jesus is born. Because that sets the worldview that his life, when he enters the world, and what he has to deal with and what he's encountering. And then finally frames 19, 20, 21, 22, Jesus, and then the New Testament community that revolves around Jesus. Okay? Again, just a big overview. I don't expect you're going to walk away knowing everything you'll sing on this little chart, because we're going to mainly focus in, boom, on those 22 frames and what they teach us and what do they explain to us about the big story of Jesus. Now, one of the things that I emailed, everybody maybe didn't get a chance to see this. I emailed you links with about 4 or 5 different videos to look at, preview, to just help you get ready for it. It's from the Bible Project, and if you're not aware of the Bible Project, it's a great resource. It's a nonprofit. They need to raise money to do, so as part of what you donated today, I'm going to be sending a donation to them because they are totally a nonprofit. They don't have a church. They just depend upon people's goodwill. But the great thing is because they supply all this free. So they've got a group of animators and graphic people, and then their scholarly people who put it all together, and they just do an amazing job. I use it in confirmation all the time. I use it in Bible studies all the time. The first set that I asked you to look at were the first 4 in a series that they call How to Read the Bible. There's like 20 of them in that section. They're really good. The first 4 just kind of introduce us to the Bible. I want to watch just that third one again. To open up with, and it's called The Bible, Getting the Big Picture of the Bible. And they do an incredible job of breaking that down. So, I haven't tested the volume. I haven't never used this computer on this TV, so I haven't tested the volume. So, plug your ears, you never know what's going to happen.
The Bible's an important book, but it's really long.
Yeah, it's a collection of many books written over a long period of time, but altogether they tell one unified story.
So, what's the story of the Bible?
Well, it begins by introducing us to a beautiful mind, the author of all reality, a being called God. And he has the power to take the dark chaos of the uncreated world and bring about order and beauty and a garden full of life.
And to crown this accomplishment, God appoints these creatures called humanity,
Or in Hebrew, Adam.
and they're made as God's image.
Which means that they're commissioned to rule this beautiful world on God's behalf by harnessing all of its potential and creating even more beauty and order.
This is a story about humans using their power to do meaningful, life-giving work. But the question is, how?
Yeah, humanity now faces a choice that's represented by a fruit tree. So humans could partner with God and find freedom by trusting in his knowledge of good and evil.
Or
They could seize power and define good and evil on their own, which, God warns, will kill them.
And they hear the voice of a dark, mysterious creature that tells them the choice is simple. Take the fruit. It'll give you power and freedom to rule the world on your own terms.
And so they seize this knowledge, and as a result, they become suspicious and self-protective. It leads to fractured relationships, violent power grabs, and ultimately, a whole civilization, Babylon, that has redefined evil as good. And so, God scatters this corrupted human project.
And here the story of the Bible takes an important turn. We zoom into the story of a man and a woman who come out of Babylon, Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah, God promises that from them will come a new people, a nation that has another chance to make the right choice. And if they succeed, it will open up this new way forward for the rest of humanity.
And this is why the rest of the Bible story is about this family.
And it does not go well. Despite God's personal guidance, Abraham's family gives in to that same temptation to redefine good and evil on their own terms, apart from God.
Even when their best people were in charge, rulers who loved God's guidance and had divine wisdom, even they gave in.
And so Israel was warned by their own prophets that these choices would lead them back to Babylon, this time as conquered captives living in exile, and that's exactly what happened.
So even with God's personal guidance, Israel fails. Who can succeed?
Well, the prophet said that the story wasn't over. God's going to send a new leader to Israel to cover for their failures and to transform the people's hearts and minds so that they can make the right choice.
And so the part of the Bible called the Old Testament ends, and these promises are left hanging.
And then the biblical story continues into the New Testament. We're introduced to a man who comes from the line of Israel's kings, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said that he was bringing all these promises to their completion.
He confronted that dark, mysterious evil that all humanity is given into and resisted its power.
And then he announced that God had arrived to rule the world through himself. Jesus taught about God's definition of good and evil, and he said that real power is serving others. According to Jesus, it's people who love the poor and even love their enemies. These are the kinds of people who actually rule the world.
And that's confusing, but also really beautiful.
And so is the claim that the story goes on to make about Jesus, that he is God become human, to be for Israel and for all humanity what we could never be for ourselves. He came to take the consequences of our evil into himself, and his sacrificial love proved more powerful than evil, than even death itself.
So now humanity's presented with a new choice.
Represented by a new tree.
Stick with the old way of being human, or venture into this new way.
And in the story, those who choose the way of Jesus find themselves energized by God's own power. People who know that they are loved and forgiven by God can become people who love and forgive others in return.
The Jesus movement quickly spread throughout the world, forming these new communities of people who follow the way of Jesus.
But they faced problems. There was persecution from the outside by people in power, and inside there was confusion, even compromise.
Yeah, because following Jesus is really hard.
And so the movement's leaders, called apostles, they wrote letters to comfort and to challenge these communities to stay faithful to the difficult way of Jesus.
And they're called to hope for the day when Jesus will come and change everything.
And so the Bible ends by pointing to the future day when all wrongs are made right, when evil is eradicated, heaven and earth are united, and humanity can rule the world together in the love and power of God.
Okay, so that's the story of the Bible. And it brings all of these books together.
But what's interesting is that each book contains a different kind of literature that contributes to this story in a unique way. And that's what the next video will begin to explore.
All right.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching this Bible
Yeah.
Project video. This is part 2 of our How to Read the Bible.
The Bible is an important book.
All right. So, again, I didn't get to see the whole thing again, but the one thing that I just didn't, I missed it. I've watched it like 5 or 6 times. The scene when Jesus is walking through the wilderness and the tempter's there, and he doesn't succumb. I missed that totally. So I'm always learning stuff. So it's a good thing. So, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to put your timeline away, and we're going to go to the book. That little booklet that's in front of you. All of the frames are going to be recopied on here, and they're going to take us through. So these first three frames that are on our timeline, that are also on the book, page 1 there, 1 through 3, all three of these frames deal with the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Okay? And I kind of sets the foundation. I don't want to say it's the prequel, but it's kind of like the prequel. The biblical story really starts at Genesis 12 with Abraham and his family. Okay? And chapters 1 and through 11 kind of are like the prequel. Why do we need this story? And that's what these first 3 chapters are about. So that first frame, we're going to break down part by part, but that deals with the entire biblical story. Like I said, Genesis 1 through 11. That second frame, this is God's original plan. And then the third frame is what went wrong with that original plan. Okay? So here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to watch how frame 1 gets connected to God's original frame, and then this part, 2, 3, 4, 5, these little frames, what went wrong with the plan. Okay? And all of this is setting the stage to introduce us to this character by the name of Abram. Okay? And how God chooses him to be the one who's going to set right what went wrong with the world. Okay? So God reveals a purpose in bringing creation and humanity to existence and what went wrong. That's really the first 11 chapters. God had a plan. Humanity broke the plan. God's going to make a plan to make it right again. Okay? And it gets us to the story of Abraham. So there it is. And this idea of the ripple effect of sin then. How sin, one sin, affects everything in the world. So we're going to start with this very little picture right here. This is the creation story. When God brought everything into the world. Now this will be our symbol. And every graphic that we have, this is our symbol for God. Some of you have heard me talk about that before. Do you remember why this is a good symbol for God? James, you smile. Do you remember?
Because love goes up from God.
Okay, so the arrows go out from the circle because that's God's chief characteristic. The circle is a pretty great symbol for God because circles have no beginning. They have no end. Our God has no beginning, no end. He's always just one God, one circle. And then the arrows that go out from him, his chief characteristic that he self-defines himself as, is he's a compassionate God, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. So that's our symbol. And everything you see, that'll be our symbol for God. So in the very beginning, the symbol for God that signifies he has no beginning or end, and the arrows of his love always going out from him, is a God who creates. He marvelously speaks into existence the heaven and the earth, the light, sun, moon, stars, vegetation, birds, sea life, animals and cattle, and finally on day 6 as well, humankind. The heavens, okay, the sky, the universe, and the earth, where humans are intended to live. And then he creates and fills all those things. Finally, on the last day, he creates humanity. And remember how the biblical nature says that we are created in what?
His image.
In his image and in his likeness. But that does not mean that we're created to look like God, right? The image of God is, what's his chief characteristic? Love. His compassionate love that goes out from him. And so we are to live under God. So there's God, there's humanity. The dudes wear the straight legs, the ladies got the bell bottoms. I don't know why, that's just the way this Australian artist did it. We live under God. He is the maker and the owner. And how do we serve this God? Well, this God who loves us, we serve him by serving and loving each other. And that goes over to this frame number 2 then. This is God's original plan. These are 2 people not praying, but in kneeling posture is a symbol for being a servant, right? That we are to live on planet Earth by loving and serving God, by loving and serving each other. And so we've got the whole community of Earth gathered around, hand in hand, and everybody isn't living just for themselves. Everybody was designed to live for each other. That's God's original plan. Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2. Now I'm going to break off for a second, and I'm going to let us watch another video from the Bible Project, because they do a great job of explaining these first 11 chapters, and we're going to dig into them a little bit more.
The first book in the Bible is a book you've probably heard of. It's called Genesis.
Genesis comes from a Hebrew word, it's pronounced reshit, and it just means beginning.
Now, there's a lot of stories from the book of Genesis, and it's easy just to pull out a specific story and try to tell you what it might mean. But we think the best way to understand this book is to look at the book as a whole and show you how the whole thing is designed.
The book is designed to fall into two main parts. You have chapters 1 through 11, which is telling the story of God and the whole world. And then you have the second part, which is about God and Abraham's family. That's chapters 12 through 50. And how the two of those parts relate, that's where you find the message of the book.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning. The first part of Genesis begins with a creation story where God creates everything.
And how exactly that happens, of course, that's where all the debates come. But he takes a dark, watery chaos and he turns it into a beautiful garden where humans can flourish.
That sounds nuts.
It does sound nice. In fact, 7 different times God says of all that he's made that it's good.
And this is where we meet the first human characters in the Bible, Adam and Eve.
They're both individual characters, but they're also representative. Adam is the Hebrew word for humanity, and Eve is the Hebrew word for life. And God creates them in his image. In other words, humanity reflects, or is meant to reflect, the creativity, the goodness, and character of the Creator out into the world that he's made. And they're supposed to reproduce and make cultures and neighborhoods and art and gardens and everything else. But he gives them a moral choice about how they're going to go about building this world.
And this is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about.
And he tells them, don't eat of the fruit of this tree or you will die. What's that all about?
So up till now, God has been the one defining and providing what is good. And so God is the one with the knowledge of good and evil. But now this tree represents a choice. Will the humans trust God's definition of good and evil? Or are they going to seize the opportunity and define good and evil for themselves?
And Adam and Eve eat the fruit.
This is the core biblical explanation for that concept of sin, that desire to call the shots myself. It's the inward turn of the human heart to do what's good for me and my tribe, even if it's at the expense of you and your tribe.
And the problem is humans are horrible at defining good and evil without God. And so now that humanity's made this choice, things get really
bad. So Genesis 3 through 11 is like tracing this downward spiral of all humanity. So Adam and Eve, they can't trust each other anymore. And so there's a little story about how they were naked and felt fine about it beforehand, but now they feel shameful because all of a sudden Adam's definition of good and evil might be different than Eve's, and so they hide from each other.
Then there's another story of temptation. Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, and he gives in and kills him.
There's a story right after Cain about a guy named Lamech, and all we know about Lamech is that he accumulates wives like property, and he sings songs about how he's a more violent, vengeful person than Cain ever was, and he's proud of it.
Things get so bad with the human race that we see God decide to just wipe us out.
Yeah, we typically think of the flood story as about God being angry, but it actually begins with God's sadness and grief about the state of his world. And so out of his passion to preserve the goodness of his world, he washes it clean with the flood.
But there's a glimmer of hope. He chooses Noah and his whole family, and he saves them on this boat.
Yeah, don't forget about the animals.
Right, and the animals. So Noah and his family are going to reboot all of humanity. I mean, he must be a pretty great guy.
But this is the story most people don't know because it's kind of weird, is that Noah gets off the boat and he plants a vineyard and he gets totally plastered. And then something sketchy happens in his tent with his son. It's a tragic story.
So from here, humanity grows again, but things are as bad as before. And the last story is the famous story of the Tower of Babel.
And in this story, you have all of the nations uniting together to use this new technology they have, the brick. And they want to make a name for themselves and build this big city with a huge tower that will reach up to the gods. But God knows that this city will be a nightmare. And so in his mercy, he scatters them.
And all of these stories, they're underlining the same basic idea. When humans seize autonomy from God, when they define good and evil for themselves, it results in a world of tragedy and death.
And this leaves you wondering, is there any hope for humanity?
Yes, yeah, there is. It's the very next story that answers that question. It's the beginning of God's mission to rescue and restore his world.
Hey there, this is Tim.
This is John.
Hey,
Do you
John.
believe the best way to understand the Bible?
I do too. That's why I use you
The
guys.
first
all
book
the
of the
time.
Bible?
All right, so they set the stage, right? These first 11 chapters, the ones that we know the stories pretty well, they've got a purpose. They're going to tell us the way that the world was intended, what went wrong, what is God going to do about it, to set the stage to introduce us to God's final answer to setting the world right, introducing us to the family of Abraham. Okay? So open up your Bibles now to Genesis chapter 3. So the bottom of this first frame, all these little pictures right here, are going to introduce us to this theme of the ripple effect of sin. Okay? So Genesis chapter 3. Who wants to read with a big voice? James, I'm going to ask you. James, you want to read verse 3, verses 1 through 5.
Okay.
Big voice, James.
Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of the tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'"
I'm sorry. One more verse.
So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm holding up my Bible, and I've got 3 pages pinched. This is Genesis chapters 1 and 2. This is God's original plan. This is what God intended when he, out of the goodness of his heart, said, "I want to make this world and I want to make human creatures to live in it, to take care of this world." And at the very last verse of chapter 2, it says, "And the man and the woman were naked and they felt no shame." And whenever I have my middle schoolers read that, they giggle because you said the word naked. But God's intent, right? That's just a symbol and a sign that they had no shame. It was perfect. This is the way God intended it to be. But it didn't last that way. Genesis 3 introduces us to this serpent. And we're not going to get into where does the serpent come from, where does evil come from. That's a different class, okay? That's a different time. It's just there, evil. God did not bring evil into the world. Evil came as a result of rebellion to God. He did not bring it in. But Satan, the serpent, looks at this man and this woman and entices them to do what? Disobey, rebel, not listen to God. Did God really say? Well, God did say that we shouldn't eat from this fruit, or we shouldn't even touch it, lest we die. And then Satan says, "Oh, you will not die." Okay, somebody keep reading now. Which verse did you end on, James?
I read through 6.
So somebody want to read 7, 8, and 9. Big voice.
I will.
Thank you.
Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden.
Okay. So they ate of the fruit. Did they instantly die? No, not physically. But they did die. What death do they die at that moment?
Spiritually.
A spiritual death, yeah. They're hiding now from God. This God who they walked with, who God would take strolls with them through the garden, Now they're hiding from him. They didn't physically die instantly, but they did spiritually die. They try to cover up their shame and they hide from God. Okay? Then, read now through verse 15. Would you, again, Peggy?
But the Lord God called the man, "Where are you?" And he answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The man said, "Well, the woman put here with me, she gave me some of the fruit from the tree, and I ate it." Then the Lord said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate it." So the Lord said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all the livestock and all the wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel."
All right. So, that is the first sin, and it introduces this idea of the ripple effect of sin. And what I mean by that is what these first stories of Genesis through 11 are telling us. There's this cycle of going on. People continue to fall into sin, and Adam and Eve's rebellion affects all of their descendants. Okay, it's an inherited sin. And they're just telling us how it's expanding from the garden out to the fields, out to the entire world, and it breaks apart everything that God designed to do. And I picture it always like this idea of a ripple effect, of how one sin from the original people, Adam and Eve, affects all of creation, and everybody since it. So I used to live in the mountains of North Carolina. My kids went to school at Boone, and so we would often go up to Boone in the fall time for parents' days and for football games or whatever, and visit our kids. We would stay at a mountain house, and we would maybe do a little bit of hiking. And so imagine it's a beautiful October fall day in the mountains of North Carolina, and you're hiking along early in the morning, sun's just coming over the ridge, and all the trees are in full color. They do change color in North Carolina too. They're changing colors, and you come upon a mountain pond, right? And you're looking at it, and it's perfectly calm, not a ripple, no wind at all. And so I'm looking on that pond, and I see the reflection of all of this beauty, the Carolina blue sky, the tree colors, and along comes a guy like Paul Krause. And I'm soaking all this in. And what's at the edge of all ponds? Rocks. Yeah. So along comes Paul Krause, got a big arm, picks up one of those rocks about the size of his hand. And of course, what are you going to do, Paul? You want to throw it as high as you can, as far as you can, and you're going to disrupt my entire scene. Because you're going to take that one rock, whoosh, right to the middle, a rock this size in a big pond, and it hits in the middle. And what just happened? It ripples out, and the entire pond is distorted now. Picture that as we go through these first stories of Genesis, okay? We're not going to read them all, because we won't have time to do that. But we first of all have the division now, this ripple. There's God, and then this is our symbol for mankind, right? Woman, man, and woman. Notice when they were created, their arms were up like this in praise of God. Now their rebellion of God, their arms are on their hands or on their hips. They're kind of like indifferent to God. And so we've got this division, a lightning bolt between God and people. But not just between God and people. How did Adam and Eve react when God says, well, what did you do? What did Adam say?
I do it.
She did, yeah. And what did she do? She blamed the devil, right? The devil made me do it. Well, I got to tell you, dudes, it is all Adam's fault. It is all Adam's fault. She did it, but Adam probably never, because when God said don't eat from this tree, he instructed that to Adam. He wasn't a very good teacher, because obviously she was more enticed by what was looking pleasing to her eyes and what her husband would have shared with her. So it's really his fault. But there's this division now. But then they told us the story between the brothers. So they have two sons, Cain and Abel, right? And what does Cain, they both bring their offerings to the Lord. What does Cain do to Abel? Kills him. So now we've got the sin spreading out to the fields where a brother kills a brother. Then we get this story in Genesis chapter 6. Well, first of all, after we forget that, if your Bible is still open, go to Genesis chapter 5. I call it the saddest chapter in the Bible. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Peg, you want to read just verse 1? Big voice.
This is the written account of Adam's line. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God.
Okay. How was he created?
In the likeness of God.
Just a repeat of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God's original plan. Okay, now read verses 2 and 3.
He created them male and female and blessed them. And when they were created, he called them man. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth.
Now, the creation that they made together, Adam and Eve from God, was created in whose image? In Adam's image. The lostness of the image of God. Now people are inheriting the sin that Adam and Eve brought into this world. In our confession and worship, when we say we are by nature we are sinful and unclean, that's what we're confessing. That we are descendants of Adam and Eve. We're in the line of Adam and Eve, and we too, like Seth, are born in Adam's image. Inherited sin. Okay? Now, there's this funky story. Oh, and by the rest of the chapter, why I call this the saddest chapter in the Bible, is it says, and Adam lived so many more years and had so many other sons and daughters, and then he died.
Nice.
And then this dude lived 960, but then he died. The generations, every generation of all the people listed in that genealogy, they all died, which is not what God intended. It's the saddest chapter of the Bible. Again, could be overstatement, but I'm tend to do those sometimes. Genesis 6, then, this freaky story that introduces the division between angels and humanity. The cosmos are being divided. We're not going to read the story. Well, I guess we're going to have to, since I said it that way. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Again, Peggy, you want to read that, big voice?
When men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born of them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of the men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children with them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown.
Thank you. So, there's a lot of debate about these verses. This is my interpretation, and I think this is probably where a lot of Orthodox conservative Christians come down, is that this is a description of the division between the cosmos and the created order. So the angels are created beings as well. They come down, they're called the sons of God. Everywhere in the Old Testament, angels are often referred to as sons of God. Okay, they just are. In the book of Job and other places, the Psalms, angels are the sons of God. And they come down on earth and they have physical relationship, intercourse with women, the daughters of men. And they create this Nephilim. And the idea of it is it's so divided now that it's bringing a wickedness to every created person's heart now. And it's just spreading throughout all of creation and all of humanity. And it's gotten so bad that God sees there's only one way to deal with it. Wash it away. Wash it away with the flood. Okay? Now some will contend that this idea is, well, the sons of God were the good guys and the daughters of men were the bad guys, and that was an intermarriage. Well, probably not. I don't think it is. I don't think what the language talks about. Okay? It's a bizarre story for us. But then the flood comes and wipes things out, and then finally we get to the last story in Genesis 11 and the bricks, right? This new technology. And the people want to be like God again in chapter 11. They want to be like God, and so they build a pyramid because they live in flatlands, and they believe the gods live up in the clouds. So how do you get to the clouds if you live in the flatland? Well, you build yourself a tower. So they're building this tower to get up to the heavens to be like God. They want to be like God. They want to look into his living rooms and see how God lives so that they can be like him again. This is the slow ripple effect of sin upon the world. And what it shows is that there's this division. And so this is that frame 3. So this is our symbol for who? Okay. This is a new symbol. That arrow turned in. Remember, when the arrows go out from God, what does that describe? His love. His chief characteristic is love. God loves people. They are loved by God. They love God in return, and so they love each other in return. Well, that ripple effect brings into this idea of breaking relationships. And so all those different relationships are exposed. The relationship between God and man, broken. Lightning bolt breaks it apart. Male and female, blown apart. Brother to brother. Heavenly to earth, nation to nation, people groups. It's all divided. And the wickedness is spreading across the world. And this is our idea of sin. Humanity turns in on itself. Because this love was meant to go from him to her and her back to him. God's idea is that you're going to treat each other like I would treat you. In perfection. Never looking in for just your self-interest, your own ways, but looking out for each other. And so sin comes into this world and people turn in on themselves. I know about 6 Latin phrases, and this is one of them. It's Luther's. This is how he defined sin. One of his words to define sin was incurvate se. It just makes me feel smart. So I'm not a big Latin guy, but incurvate se. To turn in on yourself. That I now am the focus of the world. When God would say, no, your neighbor is the focus of your world. That's the way I created you, in my image. Because God's never a self-lover. God's never concerned just with himself. But now humanity is. And that breaks apart this entire way that God designed the world to be. People no longer living for the sake of others by serving God that way. People wanting to live serving themselves. So by nature, we are sinful and unclean, inherited. And so what do? Well, we haven't loved God with our whole heart. We haven't loved our neighbor as ourselves. So these first 11 chapters are introducing. God's got to deal with this one, right? God doesn't want to just give up on the world. And so what's God going to do? Again, our little question mark here, we do not know the time frame of how long this was. Just for an FYI, I am not a billions of years old creation person. I'm a young earth believer. I believe the scriptures talk of a creation in 6 days. And I think there's plenty of science that backs it up if you're interested. Those whoever went to the museum, Creation Museum, and the Ark Project down in Indiana, it's called Answers in Genesis. They've got all the science stuff behind it and all the current science people behind it.
That was Kentucky.
It's
Indiana?
Kentucky. Yeah, it's Kentucky. You're right. It is Kentucky. It's right on the Indiana border.
Okay.
I drove by it every time from North Carolina to Wisconsin, back from Wisconsin back to North Carolina for 14 years. Never stopped because it's about halfway and I just want to get to Wisconsin. And then when I'm done, I just want to get home. So I never stopped, but I should have. I digress. All right. So human sin, God's plan. What's he going to deal with this? How will God deal with everything? Well, this cone is expanding, right? Sin is infecting all the world. But then, as sin spreads, God's got a plan. It's going to converge into one couple, into one family that God's going to choose. You can remember these first 11 chapters are the prequel to introducing us to this character, Abraham, and how God's going to use Abraham and a promise that he makes to Abraham to restore the world in Genesis chapter 12. So, what I want to do is look at page 2 of your booklet. Because that's going to tell us of a pattern, right? So I'm going to look, and there's a slide up there, and there it is in front of you. Okay? So these are these first 11 chapters of Genesis, and we've got this pattern. We've got God who creates everything, and it's all good. Genesis chapters 1 and 2, right? Then we've got this cycle of all these stories, and there's this pattern where people sin, God brings his judgment, but then he also offers grace, which is, by the way, the key biblical word for understanding all of the way the Bible operates. God is a gracious God. He's slow to anger and abounding love. He wants to restore the world. He just doesn't want to condemn the world, but he wants to save the world, right? John 3:16, God loved the world in such a way that what did he do? Gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Verse 17, for God didn't send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. That's what God's plan is. So let's talk about that first story. Adam and Eve, what was their sin? Disobeying God. Ate the fruit. And resulted in the fall. What was God's judgment?
Eternal death.
It was death. Yeah. They were banned from the tree of life. God kicks them out of the garden. All right, out of the garden. Puts the angels in front of it so they can't get to the tree of life. Because if they eat of the tree of life, they would not die. So they will physically die. That's God's judgment. But it took 900 some years, but they did finally physically die. What's the grace? Well, God, do you think God knew what they did when he says, Adam, where are you? Yeah, he knew. I mean, right? When I knew my kids did something wrong, it wasn't, oh, kids, where are you? It was like, why did you, Brandon, why did you do that? Right? Not God. God's first reaction was, where are you? He knows where he is. And then finally, God, his provision. So if you can't see it very well, maybe on yours, Adam and Eve, they tried to cover their nakedness with what? Fig leaves. Didn't work so well. So what does God, at the very end of chapter 3, it says God clothed them with animal skin. He provides for them with animal skin. Well, how do you get animal skins from animal?
You have to kill them.
You have to kill them. Until then, Adam and Eve's job was to do what for the animals? Care for them. You didn't kill them. They weren't food, right? They were vegetarians, Adam and Eve. They were vegisaurs. They ate plants. All the animals ate plants. Animals did not eat one another. There wasn't Shark Week in paradise. Okay? There was no fang or claw. The animals, they just coexisted, and they all were veggie eaters, as were human beings. Well, now the first animal is sacrificed by who? By God, to provide for his creatures, Adam and Eve. Then we got the story of Cain and Abel. What was the sin? Murders his brother. Judgment. Cain is sent away. He's removed from the community. Well, what was the grace? Cain was given, in that story, a mark. Some mark that God put on him that nobody else could take vengeance on him. So he was spared. God gave grace. The story of Adam and Eve, the sin, this cosmic confusion, right? The angels, the fallen angels with the women making this Nephilim race, and all of the world is getting infected, and the spread of wickedness has filled every man's heart. Well, what's the judgment? Of the flood. What was the grace? The ark, right? God says, I'm going to save Noah, not because Noah's perfect, just Noah was a believer. Noah and his family are saved with the animals for a reboot with the ark. That's grace. Then we got the story of Adam and Eve, right? Or not Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, where they want to build brick by brick a mountain to be up like God. That's their sin. They want to be like God again. Well, God's judgment is God comes down, and the little lips there with the division, he disperses them. He confuses their languages. And now if I can't understand you and you can't understand me, am I going to live around you? No, I'm going to go with my people and people that I can understand, and you're going to go with your people and you can understand. And now there's this divisions and suspicions because I can't understand you. You must be trying to get something from me, and I'm trying to get something from you, and we spread apart, the dispersal. Well, when you get to the end of Genesis chapter 11, we don't have that next step of grace, because that's what Genesis chapter 12 is introducing. God's answer to the divided world will be calling one family, Abram. Genesis chapter 12. Does that make sense? I'm going to go back to that slide right there. So, these first 11 chapters are getting us to introduce chapter 12 and the big, long story of God's rescue mission for humanity. What will God do to restore? What will God do to offer grace? Because that's been his pattern. All along, we're only saved by grace. Grace is in the New Testament. Yeah. Grace is in the Old Testament. Yeah, already in Genesis chapter 3, there's grace. And so the rest of the Bible story is working through history. How is God going to work in history to form a people, to draw all people back to himself? To him being the God of God and light of light, the one whom all humanity will live under. And that's what Paul would say in Ephesians. We're going to get to that passage eventually, but here's a little teaser for you. Ephesians 1, 9 through 10. God has made known to us in all wisdom and insight the mystery of his will, according to his purpose, which he sets forth in Christ. All of it. Finally, to unite all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth. God's big mission, to unite everything back under him. Fallen humanity, broken creation, back under him. And he's going to do it through Jesus the Messiah. But to get to Jesus Messiah, he's going to go through Abraham. All right, so when you look at this frame, sin widens out all of humanity. God converging his grace to one family. Abraham, Sarah, their son, and then all of their descendants pass. All right? Good? All right. We're going to watch this next little clip to introduce us to chapters Genesis. So we're going to be on page 3 of the book. We're going to look at some of those passages, but we're going to do a little prequel by watching this video. We're not going to watch a video on every book of the Bible. We won't have time for that. They have done one, and multiple ones for every book of the Bible, but these first stories are really foundational. That's why we're looking at them.
We're walking through the book of Genesis, which is made up of these two main parts.
And the first part begins in the garden, where we watch humanity spiral downward in self-destruction, and it ends in the Tower of Babel, where a rebellious humanity is scattered by God.
Then the second part of Genesis zooms in and focuses on just one family.
And right in the middle is this story that links the two parts of Genesis together and helps us understand what the whole book is all about.
So how do we get from the Tower of Babel to this story here in the middle?
Well, after the scattering at Babel, there's this genealogy, and it follows one of the tribes all the way down to this one guy named Abram.
You probably know him as Abraham.
And God starts making all these promises to Abraham, like he's going to bless him and give him a ton of kids. And he says that through him and his family, all the nations of the earth are now going to find God's blessing. So basically, God is trying to restore humanity back to the goodness of the garden and to his original intentions for the world. So it's like his rescue plan for humanity. And that's why the whole second half of Genesis is about this one family. And so you have Abraham, and then he has a son Isaac, who has Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons. And to each generation, God renews his promise to bless them and all nations through them.
So because of this promise to use this family to rescue the world, it's pretty easy to read these stories as examples of how to be a good person.
But actually, for the most part, this family is totally dysfunctional. So for example, let's go back to Abraham. This whole story is about God giving him and his wife Sarah a family, but 2 different times. He basically gives Sarah away to other men by denying that she's even his wife. And then Sarah gets impatient about having a son, and so she makes Abraham sleep with her servant girl, which then causes all of these other problems in the family.
So they get really old, and you begin to think that there's no way they're going to have a kid of their own. But then, miraculously, they do. It's Isaac.
And Isaac, he has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, and it seems like things are going pretty good.
But Jacob, the younger brother, wants the family's inheritance, which belongs to Esau, the older brother. So he devises a plan where he's going to steal it from his father, Isaac, who at this point in the story is now old and blind.
But who does that? Horrible, stealing from your blind father.
Yeah, and then he just takes off.
So Jacob goes on from there to have 12 sons, big family. But Jacob loves his 11th son, Joseph, way more than all the others. And so he gives him the special Technicolor dream coat. And his brothers, because of this, come to hate him.
So much so that they plan on killing him.
But they don't. They instead just sell him as a slave down in Egypt.
Now, while in Egypt, through this crazy series of events, Joseph goes from being in a prison cell to becoming the second in command there.
And so later on, the whole Middle East falls into this food shortage. And Joseph's brothers, they come down to Egypt looking for food. And then when they get there, who should they find as the ruler of the whole land?
It's Joseph, that guy they sold into slavery. But he actually saves them from starving to death.
And so here you have it. These are the great-grandchildren of Abraham who have done this heinous act to their brother. But God has transformed their evil into something good.
And that's exactly what Joseph says here in the last paragraph of the entire book. He says, you guys planned all of this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save people's lives.
Now these words, they conclude the book because they actually summarize the message of the whole story so far. Humans keep choosing evil, and we are thinking they're screwing up God's plan, but he keeps turning their evil back into good. And somehow, he's going to use this family to restore humanity back to the garden.
So that's the book of Genesis. But we still don't know how exactly he's going to use this family to bring us back to the garden.
Well, yeah, but this is just the first book, so that's what the rest of the Bible sets out to answer.
Hey there, I'm Tim.
And this is John.
We believe that.
All right.
We're walking through the book of...
All right. So now we're going to go to covenant Abraham. So we're gonna walk through this covenant of Genesis to Abraham, and then we'll take a little bit of a break. Okay. All right. Any questions to start before we go any further? Anything? Any questions? Fine. I might say, well, we'll get to it later, or we don't have time for that one. But go ahead.
In the narration, they said the great-grandchildren of Abraham.
Yeah.
They weren't great-grandchildren, they were grandchildren, right?
Great as in awesome.
Well, Abraham, so Isaac or Jacob, Esau and Jacob would have been his grandchildren. Joseph and the brothers would have been his great-grandchildren. Yeah.
No.
So-
Wait.
Abraham had Isaac,
Yes.
so
They're children.
Isaac had Jacob and Esau. Those are
Oh,
Abraham's
I missed a
grandchildren.
generation.
Yeah.
there.
That's all right.
Okay.
All right. So they are a dysfunctional group. They are a dysfunctional group. So
Yes.
open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 12.
Yeah, I think my servant do all the different people.
God's covenant with. So this is frame number 4 on your timeline, and in your book we're on page number 3. Oops. So Genesis chapter 12. At the end of chapter 11, like he said, we got that genealogy that goes to Abraham. From the Tower of Babel, we get to Abraham's father, who was Terah, and Terah lived to be 205, and he had a son by Abraham and a couple other sons. So chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Okay. So God's making some big promises here to Abraham. So what's promise number 1? A great nation, right? So a great nation. What's another promise?
Bless you.
You will be a blessing. Okay. A great nation was number 2. Offspring, right? Family, big family. What's another one? A blessing. Well, there's one more. Actually, I guess that one doesn't come down until verse 7.
Make your name great.
Yeah, your name great. Well, look at verse 7.
Give you land.
Yeah, to your offspring I will give you this land. So that's one of the promises too. So I will give you this land. So we got that little circle of land. Abraham's descendants actually are going to get it though for 400 years. I will make you a great nation, offspring, a family. And then finally, the last one, Peggy, you said it before.
I will make your name great.
No,
Oh,
the blessing. Didn't
The
you say
blessing,
that? Yeah,
yeah.
to be a blessing. Verse 3. You will be a blessing to all the nations. And so the way of depicting that is this cup pouring out onto planet Earth. Because what's happened to all the nations of the families?
they've been split out.
They've been split up. And God doesn't want them to be split up. He wants them to be united under Him. And so Abraham, you're going to have the land. You're going to have a great big family. And your family will be a blessing for all the nations of the earth to bring them back under Him. This is called the Abraham covenant. It's unconditional. What do I mean by that? Unconditional.
You don't have to do anything.
You don't have to do anything. And you said it.
No strings.
No strings attached. Abraham's faithfulness will not break the covenant. God will still make the promise happen. Even when he tries to give his wife away twice, well, he's doing it to protect himself and his family. Okay? But it's still weird. But God always turns it to make it be something good. Because God's going to keep the promise, no matter humanity's failures or not. God's going to keep the promise. Okay? So he doesn't choose Abraham because Abraham's a really good guy. Loves him. He chooses him because of what? The G word. Grace. Only because of grace. In fact, Abram comes from the land of Ur. Does anybody know where that is? Contemporary?
Is that Iran?
It's Iraq. It's
Iraq?
Basra, Iraq. Right? And what archaeology knows, around 2000 BC, the people of Basra, Iraq, or Ur, of the Chaldeans, they worshiped the moon. He didn't worship the Lord. He worshipped the moon gods. That's who Abraham's ancestors worshipped. That's who Abraham worshipped. So God chooses him out of grace for that reason, to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. Okay? So now let's go back to Genesis, and let's read. Peg, you want to read again?
Sure.
Would you read verse 6 and 7? Big voice. Genesis 12.
Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord, and who had appeared to him.
Okay. So a big part of this promise is a great nation and the land, but for a purpose, to be a blessing for the other nations. Now, skip on down to chapter 13, and would you read verses 14 through 17 again, Peg?
The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you."
Okay, 3 big promises in this Abraham covenant, right? Land, right? Your offspring are going to have this land. I intend for you this land so that you can be a people who will be a light for the world, okay? Well, at the end of the story, they're not there, right? It's not going to happen for 400 years. But then also, going to make you a great nation. And here, as much as the dust, right? And then other times, it's going to say as many as the stars in the heavens. So your family's going to be huge. And then finally, the purpose, to be a blessing for the other nations of the world. Okay? To bring everybody back under God's headship. Okay? Now, there's another part of this picture on frame number 4. And that's this smoking pot and fire. And we're going to look at that to Genesis chapter 15. So God's made this promise. Now he's going to make a covenant with them. A covenant. So the word covenant literally means to cut. So kind of like a deal, right? But the thing is, with this deal, it's all one-sided. And God's going to use what Abraham is familiar with when people make covenants with people in his time frame. So this sounds a little weird, but this is what would happen. So let's say Belfast and I are going to make a covenant that, you know, I'm going to help him take care of his land, and he's going to let me use that land. And the way we're going to seal this is we're going to take some animals and we're going to cut them in half, right? And so we put the head part here, the back part here, and we've got a series of them, and we're going to make a promise to each other that we're going to keep our deal with each other. And we're going to walk through that and say, if I don't keep my part, may what happened to these animals happen to me. You know, I'm going to keep my deal, and you can go against me, and if I don't. And so that's how you cut a covenant in the ancient world that Abraham lived in. Sounds a little freaky, a little weird, right? Now I'm glad we just do handshakes right now, right? We'll make a deal. But that's how they made covenants in the ancient world. Okay? Now that's the framework behind this story that we're going to read here in Genesis 15. Okay? So I'm going to start at verse 9. So Abram is a little worried in the first verses of chapter 15. Abram's a little worried because God's promised him how many descendants?
Many.
More than you can count. Only problem is, Abraham has how many descendants at this point? 0. Barren, he and Sarah are barren, right? And so he's a little worried. God, thanks for the promise, but my servant Ellie is going to get all of it because I don't have any kids. No. God says, don't worry about that. Listen to verse 9. So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all of these to him, cut them in two, arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. I don't know why. They're too small, probably. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. Now, as the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. God seeing already the time of the Exodus. But I will punish that nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Now when the sun had set, and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared, passing between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates, the land of all those ites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, Amorites, Jebusites, and all the mites. Okay? So, here's what's happening in this picture. God is saying, I'm going to cut a deal with you, a covenant, a promise. You're doubting it. I get it, Abraham. You're a human. You don't have any kids. You're wondering. You know that you age out and pretty soon, you dry up and you don't have kids anymore. It's just that way. I get it. Well, God says, no, I'm going to show you I'm good with this promise. You know how you make covenants with people around you? Let's do that. Cut the animals in half. And when Abraham is in his sleep, in his vision, he sees this fire pot. So you got that little symbol of the fire pot. And it passes between the animals. Well, what's that fire pot?
God.
It's God. Yeah, it's God. He's passing through that. Those animal have. So God's saying, may the fate that overtook these animals happen to me if I break my promise. So God's appearing in a form, a fire pot, and he says, that's it. I'm going to pass through it. It's as good as done. And God's never going to break his promise. And it doesn't depend on Abraham's faithfulness. And Abraham awakes from it and believes that God's going to do this. Seems a little freaky to us, but that's God's promise. And he's not going to break that promise. All right. You got any questions? It's a little bizarre story, but that's what's happening tonight. Okay. God's appearing in a visible form to Abram. And decides to make that promise. Okay. And what was the covenant again?
Many children.
Many children. Land.
Blessing the nation.
Blessing. The mission to be a blessing for all the nations. Good job. Now, why did God choose Abraham? Well, there's nothing special about Abraham. Keep in mind that before God called him, Abraham did not know the Lord. In fact, this is what Joshua says hundreds of years later. Joshua said to the people, "Thus the Lord says to the God of Israel, long ago your ancestors Terah and his sons Abraham and Nahor lived beyond the Euphrates, and what did they do?"
The moon god.
The moon god. That was the chief god of where they came from. And who did it? Not just Abraham, or not just Terah, his father, but also his sons, Abraham and Nahor. Now, at some point, God revealed himself to Abraham and says, I'm the creator God, and I'm going to choose you. Go to this land, I'm going to show you. And Abraham does, he follows it. But not because he was any better than anybody else. God only chooses people for what reason? By what word? G? Grace. All right, so last question I got on the bottom of page 3. Does this promise of the land still apply today? Because, of course, that's what headline news is every day since October 7th of 2023. Okay, so let's go to 1 Kings chapter 9. I know we're going to have to do, I promise we won't do a lot of Bible gymnastics. We'll try to go sequentially, but we got to go to this story first. 1 Kings chapter 9. So this is 1,000 years later, and the people are now in the land, and God has brought them back, and the kings have been above them, but they haven't done everything that they're supposed to be doing, even with the wisdom of Solomon.
Surprise, surprise.
1 Kings chapter 9. I'm sorry I can't tell you which. I can tell you, Belfast, because you got the same Bible as I got. 488. All right. Everybody get a chance to find it? 1 Kings chapter 9. It says, the Lord appears to Solomon. Okay. When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and had achieved all he desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time as he appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I've heard the prayer and the plea you have made before me. I've consecrated this temple, which you have built, by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me in integrity and heart and uprightness as David your father did, and do all that I command and observe my decrees, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, when I said to him, you shall never fail to have a man over the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees that I have given you, and you go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land. Did you see that? That part of the promise would end if they did what?
If they did nobody else.
If they served other gods. Doesn't mean if they've sinned, but if they unrepentantly become idolaters. So if you do that, then I will cut Israel off from the land I have given them and will reject this temple I have consecrated by my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among the peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, all who pass by it will be appalled and scoff and say, why, the Lord has done such a thing to these people and to this temple. And people will answer, because they've forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That's why the Lord brought all this disaster on them. So the writers of Kings, God in this vision is telling Solomon, you know what, that land part, if you forsake me and become unrepentant idolaters serving these other gods, you lose the land. I cut you off, Israel, from the land. Well, that happened. And the land part of the promise is gone. But God's not done with his promise, because what was the third part of that covenant?
Blessing.
I will make you a blessing. God's purpose for Abraham and his descendants wasn't so that they could live in a chunk of land that we call Palestine or Israel. It was so that they could be the ones who would restore the world back to God's plan. That part of the promise he will not break. All right. So 1 Kings said, the promise, does it apply today? No. Israel does not have a claim to that land because of the biblical promise. And many Zionist Christian people say that. But it's not biblical. It's just not biblical. Okay, enough of that, off of that soapbox for a second. Any questions? Abraham's, again, called by grace. It's an act of grace that God chooses Abraham. Not Abraham's faithfulness, nothing special about Abraham. So what about this journey then of Abraham? So let's go to page 4. And this is frame number 5 on your timeline. Okay, so we're going to read a couple verses. So we're going to go back to Genesis now. Verse 31. Okay, Genesis 11, verse 31. We're just going to read all those verses at the top of that I got listed off there at the top of page 4. Okay. So, Genesis 11, verse 31. Can I call on you again, Miss Peg?
Sure. Terah took his son, Abram, his grandson, Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law, Sarai, the wife of his son, Abram, and together they set out for Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But then they came to Haran. They settled there.
And go ahead.
Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran.
Okay, so the patriarch's journey, oops, I gotta go back, starts right here. Boom, that's where it starts. That's Ur of the Chaldeans. Again, today, this is the Euphrates River. This is the Tigris River. This flows through the land of Iraq today, and it empties into the Gulf of Aqaba. That's where he comes from. That's where Ur was. Okay? That's where his family starts. And of course, we got to remember these little idols here, because we already saw that Abraham, Terah, Abraham and his brother Nahor worshipped and served other gods. So we've got some images of the idols of the land of that day. Okay? And then he says they go to Haran, and that's where they stop, right there. So Haran, today that's modern-day Syria. And that's where they stop at this point. Okay? Now, let's go to chapter 12, verses 4 through 9, which we already read, but we're going to read it again. So Abram left as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all of his possessions that he accumulated, and the people that he had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And they arrived there. And Abraham traveled through as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh. It must have been a great tree. Everybody knew about it. We don't, but they did. At Shechem. And at that time, the Canaanites were in the land, and the Lord appeared to him and said, to your offsprings, I will give this land. And so he built an altar there, and to the Lord who appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel, pitched his tent, and with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called out in the name of the Lord. And Abraham set out and continued toward the Negev. Okay, so he camps out there for a while till finally God says, okay, time to leave again. And boom, he goes down here to the land of Canaan. So this is the Mediterranean Sea, that's the Dead Sea, and he camps out there for a while. Okay. Now, well, we're not going to read the whole story. In verses 10 through 20, there's some famine in the land, and so they go down to where everybody goes when there's famine. You go to Egypt. Why go to Egypt when there are food struggles in the world?
Nile River.
The Nile River, you are right. The Nile River, which starts down here in Uganda at Lake Victoria and flows north. And you get to the Egyptian basin of the Nile River, and it's usually a food source of abundance because you have water, which you need to grow crops. And so they've got irrigation. And so it becomes, everybody wants to have Egypt because it usually could supply you with food even in the midst of famine and drought times. Okay? So he goes down there and stays for a while, but then he goes back up to the land of Canaan. Okay? And then, let's see, the last one, chapter 46. Let's go to chapter 46 again. So in the story of Genesis, you got Isaac, and then you got Jacob, and Jacob's got how many sons? 12. And Joseph, the second youngest, ends up being sold as a slave in Egypt. But because God wanted to have Andrew Lloyd Webber write a great musical, he is raising up to help save the world. And now all the family is going to go down back to Egypt again. So chapter 46, verses 1 through 7. You want to read that one again, Peg?
So Israel set out with all that was his.
Israel is, by the way, the name of who? Jacob. Yeah, his name was changed to Israel. I'm sorry, Peg.
And when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here I am, he replied. I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, so I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives to the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport them. They also took with them their livestock and the possessions they had acquired in Canaan. And Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt. He took with him to Egypt his sons and grandsons and his daughters and granddaughters, all his offspring.
So the clan of Abraham and his grandchildren end up where? And his great-grandchildren? Egypt. So they're back down now in Egypt. Okay. We got one little last graphic on this frame, and this is a little field with a little cave there. What do you think that's about? It's the only piece of land that Abraham will actually own. And it's the story, we're not going to read it because it's a long story, Genesis 23, but it's a funny story. Sarah, well, this part's not funny. Sarai's died, and Abraham has to do what when your wife dies? Got to bury her. Yeah. And so he goes to Ephron the Hittite, and Abraham doesn't own any land. He's nomadic. He journeys around. And he negotiates, they've got to buy a burial plot for his wife, for his family. And so he sets a price, and Ephron says, no. And the whole thing is they're just bartering about what the price is going to be. And by the time the end of the story is, guess what the price is?
Nothing.
Exactly what Abraham had said at first. So, Ephron the Hittite, no, you don't need to buy it. I'll just give you that. No, I want to pay you for this. No. And, well, I'll give you this. Okay, I'll take that much, which was the original thing. It's just kind of a funny story. But it's a burial plot. That's all that he owns. Abraham only possesses a burial plot for his family. He'll never own this land, nor will his descendants for 400 more years. But that's the way that God works. That's the way God works. And then the last bullet point there on that first part, we already looked at that story. Joshua, God calls them because of grace, because they're worshiping and serving other gods. What does that say about how God deals with people? Grace. It's all about grace. We're not going to read through all of these cliffhangers, but I do want to look at the two highlighted passages. So go to Genesis chapter 26. This is the story of God coming to Isaac. Remember, finally, they do have the kid, right? The cliffhangers are, 100 years old and 90 years old. That's beyond baby producing years. And God says, no, you're going to have the baby. Well, Sarai, remember, she tries to do it her own way with her servant girl Hagar. She does have a son. His name is Ishmael. And by the way, Ishmael's the son of Abraham then, right? By another woman. But that's not the way God planned it. Do you know all the descendants of Ishmael are? Arabs. The descendants of Ishmael are the Arabs. Who have the Arabs all been in conflict with?
The Israelites.
The descendants of Isaac and Abraham, Isaac. Yeah, the Israelites. The sexual sin of Adam and Sarai, we're still feeling the consequences 4,000 years later. So that's just a reality. All right, so chapter 26. This is Isaac. He's the son of Abraham and Sarai. And we're going to read starting at verse 1. Now there was a famine in the land besides the earlier famine of Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give this land, and I will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws, and so Isaac stayed in Gerar." Did any of those words sound familiar?
I thought we were reading another verse.
This is the same promise that was given to Abraham, wasn't it? The land, offsprings, be a blessing. It's going to go through Isaac. Okay? And then we go over to chapter 28. Isaac's got two sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob's the trickster, the liar and deceiver, but God's going to use him nevertheless. Jacob's running for his life in chapter 28. Jacob left Beersheba, set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head, lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And there above it, God, the Lord, stood and said, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac, and I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out from the east to the west, to the north and the south, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until what I have done, I have promised you." Sound familiar? Same promise. Land, offspring, be a blessing for all the nations. God's going to keep his promises. All right. Okay, remember, this is all one continuous storyline of God rescuing and restoring the world that he created that fell apart by sin, by humanity's evil. Okay? All right. That's a lot. Your bottoms can only take so long, and so we'll take a break, and we'll take a 6-minute break. Get some coffee. There's some snacks over there, cheese and crackers. Sweeter stuff over by the coffee table. Thanks for that, Peg and Cindy. And John made coffee